And even then, that gospel writer, Mark, leaves it up to your imagination to piece together who I am. There are three different episodes of unnamed people that when you just read it, you think they're different folks. But if you would bear with me in my testimony, it's me. 3 episodes, 1 person. Kind of sounds Trinitarian. 2 of the stories you've already read this morning. One that is uniquely my story that's only in Mark. All this crazy newfangled technology. If I told it to you, you'd think I was crazy. But it really is in the Bible, so I'm going to read it straight to you so you know I'm giving you the straight stuff. Now, this first part, you know. In fact, I hear tell that it was read here last week. It's the whole thing in the garden with the betrayer who kisses Jesus, right? And the soldiers come, and the one disciple pulls out a sword and cuts off the ear of one of the high priest's guards. And the part that you read ended, all of them deserted him and fled. But this is where I come in. A certain young man, I was much younger in those days, was following him, wearing nothing but a linen cloth. They caught hold of him, but he left the linen cloth and ran off naked. It's right there. I promise, don't worry, I'm not going to do a reenactment. But the first time I met Jesus, I was nowhere near as well off as that. You see, I was who they called the demon-possessed man in the land of the Gerasenes. They called it demons. It just felt like lots of voices to me, all at war inside my head. My backstory is long and brutal, and you don't have time for it here. And frankly, even if you did have time, I'm not sure I'd want to remember it all. But suffice it to say, the voices in my head had made my behavior so erratic, so scary to people that they had exiled me from the village of Gergesa, and they'd made me live among the tombs. It was along the seashore. They tried to chain me like a wild animal. Oftentimes I could break free of those chains and they'd have to come and re-subdue me. Mark says that I howled. I don't think howling is the right description. I think of that as a wolf or a wild dog noise. No, it was more like this cacophony of sound. It was all the voices trying to burst out at once, at war with each other. I would beat myself with stones. I think trying to beat the voices out of me, but of course that did no good. When I saw the boat coming toward me, I knew right off the bat that something was wrong. No boats would ever come right where I was. They would all make a wide berth of the tombs and head to Gergesa, where the village was. But this boat was coming straight at me. And as it drew closer, some of the voices in my head recognized who it must be. That it was Jesus. Part of me was excited. The part of me that was my original voice, my image of God voice. Excited, maybe it meant healing, maybe it meant freedom, but most of me, all those other voices and even a part of the true me was terrified. When he came up on the shore, the excited part of me ran toward him and lunged and fell on my knees before him. But the terrified part of me screamed out, "Jesus, Son of the Most High God, I adjure you by God, do not torment me." I know it's probably hard to understand how one could think about both healing and freedom and torment in the same thought. But that was what was going on in my head. I wasn't sure what would become of me if I lost all those other voices. I know it doesn't make sense. I didn't like the other voices, but I'd grown accustomed to them. And I wasn't even sure which one was the real me anymore. And if they were gone, who would I be? What would I do? But Jesus called that unclean spirit, he called it, those voices, out of me. I've struggled for years to try to figure out exactly how to explain this. Think about the loudest cacophony that you've ever been in. The loudest batch of noise, and imagine that you've had to live with it, sleep with it, going on all the time. So much that you weren't used to it, but you were accustomed to it, if you know what I mean. And all of a sudden it was I've heard people use the expression, the silence was deafening. This was more than deafening. This was like overwhelming. I actually don't remember much for the few moments, or maybe there were many moments after that. I lost consciousness. And I found myself waking up, sitting on a stone outside the tomb, and Jesus was next to me, talking to me. And I was in a new robe, and there was only one voice. Mark says, I was clothed and in my right mind. And I wanted so badly to go with Jesus. I wanted to follow him. And he said no. But he didn't say no like, no, I don't want you following me. No, it was no like with intentionality. There was a plan. I'm not sure what that plan is. The plan was that he would send me back to the village where long ago I had lived and still had friends and family and neighbors who knew me, and I was to tell them all that the Lord had done for me. So I did that. I went home. It was hard. I went first to the people who I knew would be the most willing to accept me right off the bat, the people who were closest to me, and kind of worked my way out from there to friends and to neighbors. And pretty soon I had borne witness to what Jesus had done for me to just about everybody in Gargista. But I still had a yearning to follow Jesus. And when I caught wind that he was going to be near, I thought, I've already done the stuff he told me. Well, let me go find him. I did, but I stayed at a distance, and I shadowed him all throughout Galilee and Judea, and followed him through Samaria. I would stay back far enough that I wouldn't be seen, although I swear there were some times when he would sort of look my direction where I thought Maybe he knew I was there, but said nothing. I watched him feed thousands of people. I watched him heal. I heard him teach. I followed him to Jerusalem that week of the Passover. I picked up my palm branch and kind of held it in front of my face so I could be even closer in the parade and still not be discovered. I could go into the temple as far as the court of the Gentiles. I'm a Gentile after all, and thankfully it was there that Jesus turned the tables over and cast out the money changers so I could watch, so I could hear him talk about what his real purpose for the temple was, that it was to be a house of prayer for all people, even people like me. And then Thursday came, the night of the actual Passover meal, and the disciples were all gathering toward this house. I stood outside, kind of around the corner of the courtyard, and watched them straggle in, and a long time later, they walked out, and I knew something was wrong. I wished I could have been a beetle on the wall in that upper room to hear what it was that Jesus had said to them that made them so upset, so agitated. You could see it in their body language. And I shadowed them to the garden that night. I stayed back in the olive trees and watched everything unfold of Jesus taking some of his disciples further off to pray and coming back and forth. He chided them for falling asleep. I nearly fell asleep myself. It was getting late, and just as I did feel like maybe I was drifting off, there was this cacophony. Roman soldiers and guards from the high priest who came in, and I watched them grab Jesus. I saw the disciple take his sword out to cut off the man's right ear, and unconsciously, I realized I was moving closer to figure out what was going on. And I got closer, not thinking about the risk of being seen. And when all the disciples deserted and fled, and I had come out way more into view than I should have, a soldier came up and grabbed me. And it was then that I just stripped right out of my linen cloth and ran off into the woods, into the olive trees, naked. I watched from a distance as they crucified Jesus. I'd never been as close as the disciples. Certainly not ever as close as his mother, but it was heart-wrenching for me enough. I stayed longer than most, long enough to see the two men who took his body and took it off to a tomb. I followed just enough to know where the tomb was. I wanted to go and pay my respects. Now, I could have done it right away. I'm a Gentile. The Sabbath shouldn't have meant anything to me. And yet I knew that Jesus was Jewish, and so to honor him, I decided I would wait until the Sabbath was over. But I would wake up extra early that morning after. I'd maybe even do a little walking when it was still technically Sabbath, before the sun was up. And I'd get to the tomb just as the sun was peeking up over the horizon. And when I got there that Sunday morning, it was like Gergesa all over again. But this time I wasn't overwhelmed by silence. I was overwhelmed by light. I blanked out again, just like I had in Gergesa. And when I came to, I was sitting on a stone again, outside a tomb again, talking with Jesus. And I wanted to go with him again. And again he said, no, I have a different plan for you. You wait here. And when the women come to anoint my body, you tell them what has happened. And you tell them that they are to go and to tell the disciples to go. And be sure you make an extra mention of Peter, because he's feeling really bad right now after that whole denial thing. Make sure you lift him up special. Ask them all to go ahead and that I'll meet them in Galilee. And so I did. I was the young man in the white robe. Well, when Luke wrote about it later, he got the man part right, but he made me into two people. When Matthew got it, the hold of the story, he made me into an angel. I thought that was rather nice. But I'm just the young man in Mark's gospel. Back in Gerasene, when I'd been sitting talking to Jesus, it was just he and I, but all around on the outskirts of the graveyard, people had gathered. And I thought maybe they'd be excited to have seen a healing, an exorcism, whatever it was that happened to me. But it said they were afraid. I could tell. Isn't it ironic? They'd never actually been afraid of me when I was chained up and beating myself with stones and making all sorts of racket. I was out of sight, out of mind. It wasn't until I was clothed and in my right mind that they were afraid of me. Because now they knew that I was free. They'd have to deal with me. I'd be walking amongst them, and they'd be feeling guilt and shame about all the stuff they did to me all that time. That first, what you now call Easter morning, I thought the women would be excited that Jesus was alive. Makes sense to me. Doesn't it make sense to you that they would be excited and celebratory? But they ran off scared. And initially they didn't tell anybody. Now obviously they must have told somebody eventually or y'all wouldn't be here, but initially they said nothing. Isn't that strange? And yet everything had changed for them, and even though it was better, it was still scary. How would they deal with this new Jesus? What did it even mean? Raised from death. Would he be scary? Would he be powerful? Would he be the same Jesus they'd walked and talked with? It's funny, we all deal with things that seem to be changes for the better that can make us afraid or make us not know what to do. Think about where your country was, along with the rest of the world, 4 years ago. You couldn't be here on Easter because of a global pandemic. You engaged with Easter worship through a screen. There was a lot of fear, a lot of anxiety, a lot of unknown. And here we are 4 years later, and we have the choice either to pretend it never happened or to process it and figure out What is the world supposed to look like now? Who are we supposed to be? And that's kind of scary. Your local community right here. The judgment hall is empty now. Your version of the Antonia, that judgment hall where Jesus was in Jerusalem, your Oakland County Courthouse has already dealt with the young man who killed 4 innocent high school students and his parents, the Crumleys. And many of you have thought that once that was over, everything could return to normal. But it can't. It's better that there's justice and accountability, but now you have to face, what does the world look like now? Who are we to be? What are we to do? It's both terrifying and hopeful. That was kind of my experience of Jesus the whole time. Somewhat terrifying, but oh so hopeful. After my experience of Jesus, I know I can never be the same. I hope it will be that way for you too.